let's go way back in time to a beautiful time called 1981. And there's an Indian economist named Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen's going to end up winning the Nobel Prize in Economics as well. But let's just talk about his theory really quick, and then we'll do what we were doing for this particular set of theories called democracy. Here's a quote from him. Hunger is best seen in terms of failure of people's entitlements. That is, their failure to establish command over an adequate amount of food and other necessities. So here's his essential argument. If I just wrap up this sort of very famous book called Poverty and Famines. Hungry people will demand that the government act. So here's the deal. I just want you to picture yourself that you are facing hunger and starvation. Do you just sit there, curl up, and die? Or let's imagine that because of the coronavirus or something like that, there's a lack of food. Do you think Americans would just sit back and say, okay, well, that's the way it is? Or would they tell the government to go do something about this? So here's the deal. Hungry people are going to demand their government act if, number one, there is a responsive government. We wouldn't expect that to be the case in North Korea because the North Korean dictator isn't really responsive to the people. But in America, the government is very responsive. And then there has to be an active populace. In other words, the people have to believe that by speaking up, something can happen. So what he says essentially is, why don't we see hunger in democracies as much? And the answer is because democracies know they have to do something about it. Democracies, so his theory is this: democracies don't have famines. So again, he's writing from India, which had been experiencing some famines until it democratized, and then didn't really have a lot of famine problem anymore, and that's sort of the argument. So, just based on this idea and what you saw from William Easterly here, let's understand how this works. The problem then why countries are poor is because they lack responsive political structures. And let me just explain this in a couple ways. Number one, a non-democracy is unable to respond well to economic crises. Like the people who are in charge of non-democracies aren't poor. And so when there's an economic crisis, they don't really feel it. The poor people feel it, but they don't have to really do what the poor people say because it's not a democracy. The second problem is, and this is probably the more important one, especially for William Easterly. Right now, let's say that the United States gives foreign aid to programs in Burkina Faso. What exactly does that mean? The U.S. takes money, or let's say a bank gives money to Burkina Faso. What that means is, so here's Burkina Faso, here's the people of Burkina Faso, but here's the government. The money goes to the government, and then the government decides what to do with it. We call that sovereignty, right? If the United States went around the government and spent the money how it wanted to, or the UN did this, let's put the UN there as well, then it violates the sovereignty of Burkina Faso. So the UN and the US, when they give money directly to the government. Now, if the government is corrupt, and we tend to think that non-democratic governments tend to be more corrupt, the officials are going to take the aid money, and the money may never get to the people. They'll spend it on things that they think are important. So, for example, if I'm a dictator, what I want to do is stay in power. So I'll take that aid money and I'll give it to the people that will help me stay in power. I'm not necessarily going to give it to the poor people. So when you give aid, essentially what William Easterly was saying is, if you get aid money to a non-democracy, or let's just say a country that has a lot of corruption, that aid money just goes away. You're just dumping money into there, and all you're doing is making the problem worse because they're taking that aid money and they're spending it on themselves. They're increasing the corruption and not sort of fixing the poverty problem. Your aid actually is making things worse. So how do you target foreign aid then? You only give the money on the condition of anti-corruption. And so you'll see a number of countries that do anti-corruption task forces. And one of the main reasons they do that is so they can get money from the World Bank. The World Bank will not give you the money if they think that money is going to fall into corruption. How else should you target foreign aid? You should target foreign aid on capitalism. And that means not just... So if capitalism needs choice, democratic choice is going to assist capitalist development. In other words, the people are going to choose economically, but they also need to choose politically. And that should involve the protection of human and civil rights. Now, again, we like this. Don't get me wrong. There are good reasons to like that, but it's not because of that. It's because that will reduce corruption, which means the money will get to the people that need it, to the poverty programs. Once you do that, once corruption is got rid of and you have a responsive government, now you can turn around and do things like the human capital, or you can turn around and do things like the modernization. But if you try to do modernization or human capital before you fix this problem, you haven't solved anything. You with me on that? That is the argument for democracy. Now, are there any problems with this particular argument? Problem number one is it turns out Sen is actually wrong. Democracies can have famines. They had a number of famines since 1981. They may not have countrywide famines, but definitely certain parts of countries have famines. So India is a democracy, and India has had famines. It's not exactly a sort of one-to-one correlation, though. It has to be more than just electoral democracy. You can't just have a democracy where essentially people vote. It's got to be one that involves those protection of human and civil rights, which is not always what countries, especially poor countries, can and have achieved. And again, when you think about this, let's say that I'm poor, okay? Again, I am struggling to make it every day. I'm living on less than $2 a day. I'm barely surviving. Do I want my government focused on civil rights, political rights, or do I want my government focused on economic rights? In other words, helping me with welfare and things like that. The answer is I am far less concerned about democracy than I am about, economic growth or welfare, things like that. And so the argument sort of goes that really you're focused in the wrong place. Democracy is tied to modernization, so which comes first? And the modernization people say modernization precedes democracy. You have to have a growing economy before you can have democracy. If you have democracy before you have a growing economy, you have a lot of pissed off, hungry, poor voters, and they're not going to vote smartly, I guess is the idea. Marxism. This is the wrong type of democracy. Of course, Marxism is going to say that. Democratic change threatens those in power. Now, okay, so I'm the dictator. Let's say that I'm the dictator. If there's a democracy, I probably won't get reelected. In fact, I may find myself in jail or worse. So then will I allow your foreign aid to come into my country if it's going to threaten my power? The answer is probably not. So no aid's going to come in at all. Different cultural meanings of corruption. Like, what do we mean when we say corruption? I've used this example in other classes before, but let me just use it again. Let's say Sage came into class, and for some reason, Sage was on a baking spree, and she baked me 3 dozen cookies. And in front of class, like just before class starts, she walks up, she hands me the 3 dozen cookies. Would you guys have a problem with that? The answer is probably not. You would just say, Sage is being nice. Now let's say that Sage walked in, and instead of putting a plate of cookies in front of me, she puts a $20 bill in front of me, in front of the class, and then goes and sits down. Would you guys be okay with that? And of course, the answer is probably no. So what's the difference between a plate of cookies, which might cost about $20 in terms of time, labor, all that kind of stuff, and just a $20 bill? Why is one okay and one not okay? Why is one considered corruption and one is just Sage being a nice person? This is part of the thing, is there's different cultural meanings of corruption. What we would consider corrupt is not exactly what, like, say, Burkina Faso considers corruption. So how does that sort of play out in terms of reducing corruption around the world? Are we just saying, again, a Western version of corruption has to be gotten rid of? Like, how do we actually talk about that? So there are some problems with this. And again, the question is not whether democracy is a good idea or not. The question is whether democracy comes first or whether it comes after some of those other things you talked about. The democracy people say it has to come first because if you try to do those other things first, your money just falls into a black hole of corruption. The other guys, the modernization, the human capital, say if you do the democracy first, well, then you've basically created a lot of free people who are really pissed off and don't have a way to make money or to grow. So there are some problems with both these, and this is part of the conversation. Which comes first? All right, we have one more to talk about.